All right. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Giacomo for being available. So I'm going to introduce Giacomo shortly. So Giacomo is an Italian PhD in literature, specialized in memory of the Vietnam War as it appears in contemporary arts, so both novels and films, and especially interested in the work of Vietnamese American authors. Lately he published his first book on Viet Thanh Nguyen, which is a famous but somehow controversial writer. So congratulations on that, and can't wait to hear more about your publication. I won't be any longer. Once again, thank you, Giacomo, for being here. I let you present, and then we'll have the Q&A as usual. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Guillaume, and thank you all you guys for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back in Vietnam, if only virtually, alas. So here we are. Can you see the image shift? All right. So 2 years ago in Southern California, I shared a pleasant afternoon with a movie legend. While pouring me tea in their Huntington Beach house, movie star Kieu Trinh, an 80-year-old silk-clad goddess of the South Vietnamese silver screen, showed me the English translation of her memoir, An Artist in Exile. The freshly published volume lied on the table between us next to a luscious tray of pastries. Its photo-filled pages told the story of a woman who lived many lives. And Chin's career is basically a tragedy, a story of tragedy and success that would itself make for a great movie. A story that wins its way across eras and continents. After a decades-long career in the South Vietnamese movie industry, Chin escaped Saigon in April 1975, a mere week before the Soviet-made tanks of the People's Army will enter the city. Chin left with only a purse, a handful of crinkly dollar bills, and a little address book full of Hollywood contacts. Upon landing in Singapore, she was apprehended by local authorities, since the government that had issued her passport was no longer in power. Kieu Trinh was returning to the island city-state after only a week-long absence. In mid-April, she had wrapped up the shooting of a movie about the local youth culture. She had left Singapore a glamorous diva, only to return as an unwanted alien. In a surreal moment, she recognized her own face on the green cover of a magazine in the hands of one of the prison wardens overseeing the bathroom line. A distressed Kieu Trinh begged the guard to open up the centerfold to connect the dots between the actress featured in the overstory of the magazine and the prisoner standing in front of him. A phone call to the embassy granted Chin the chance to leave Singapore. As she writes in her memoir, Chin became homeless among the clouds. In the next 4 days, she circled the globe, one flight at a time, living out of on-board meals, leftovers, and drinking water from airport bathrooms. She eventually landed in Canada. With nothing but $30 to her name, Kieu Trinh was forced to work in a poultry farm as the first Vietnamese Canadian refugee ever. 15 days before, she was one of the most recognizable faces of Asian cinema. Now she was cleaning after the chickens. As the narrator of a novel that we will revisit in a minute summarizes, quote, none of her American movie star friends returned her phone calls until, with the last time, she snagged Tippi Hedren, who flew her to Hollywood, unquote. In Hollywood, Kieu Trinh remade her career in the American movie industry, at the price, however, of having to play Chinese or Korean characters in juggernauts such as the MASH TV series or critically acclaimed movies like The Joy Luck Club. At one point, however, none other than Francis Ford Coppola wanted Kieu Trinh to star in his Vietnam War epic, Apocalypse Now. Kyuchin was meant to portray Colonel Kurtz's native mistress. She was also to work for Coppola as a technical advisor, a movie consultant, as she would do in later years on other Hollywood's quote-unquote Vietnam sets, such as that of Hamburger Hill, also in the Philippines. She was to make sure in Apocalypse Now that every cultural detail will add up. Eventually, however, the part of Kurtz's mistress went to an uncredited Filipina actress that had no lines. The character is visible in some sequences of the Kurtz compound scenes of Apocalypse Now, but she's basically undistinguishable from, background from Dean Tavolaris' rendition of Angkor Wat that one can see in the background. Kyuchin had to pass on the opportunity because of her inability to leave the United States due to her refugee status. And so this and other ironies inform the texture of Hollywood's Vietnam, the one example that sometimes even the losers can rewrite history, a giant collective fantasy of revenge made only possible by unsung Vietnamese quote-unquote native consultants like Kyuchin, forced by the same geopolitical forces that displaced them to become extras in their own story. Now, flash forward to 2024, and in the HBO TV adaptation of Viet Thanh Nguyen's Pulitzer Prize debut novel, The Sympathizer, we see a satirical double of Francis Ford Coppola, which is called The Auteur, that hires none other than Kyuchin for his Vietnam War epic, a fictional, made-up, over-the-top send-up of Apocalypse Now with a title that channels Shakespeare and Faulkner and a plot that channels John Wayne, a chauvinistic extravaganza named The Hamlet. In a dazzling metafictional world of layers, we see Kyuchin's character playing a Vietnamese extra spouting pro-Hanoi rhetoric instead of the Orientalist platitudes dictated by the script, as you can see here. Our hands would close around the throat of American imperialism. As that line, "Don't shoot me, I'm a peasant," was good for me. And of course, that happens courtesy of the native Vietnamese consultant in case employed on the set, a communist double agent bent on sabotaging the movie, the eponymous Sympathizer. So why and how? Viet Thanh Nguyen took it on himself to dismantle 3 decades of Hollywood misrepresentations of the one conflict that changed the course of his life. What are the narrative strategies he employs? Is The Hamlet but a funny, dark satire of Apocalypse Now, or there is more to it? My talk today will be divided in 6 parts. We are going to see what exactly Hollywood's quote-unquote Vietnam is about. We are going to see why the plot of The Sympathizer takes a narrative detour at the sole goal of waging war on Hollywood's war, and we are going to see this through the 3 different angles that Nguyen tackles through his first-person narrator as he demonstrates how the distance between prestige movies from the 1970s and the right-wing Reagan-era shoddy fantasies of revenge from the 1980s is not as deep as cinephiles all around the world will love to think. Now, in a way, Kyuchin's story well exemplifies America and Hollywood's sins against Vietnam and the currently ongoing white cultural comeuppance that they are facing by courtesy of counter-narratives such as Nguyen's. The American war in Vietnam didn't end with the last chopper leaving the U.S. Embassy's rooftop in the wee hours of April 30, 1975. The war continued in memory, a veritable war after the war. Hollywood was quick to turn war trauma into spectacle. The 1970s and 1980s saw the release of countless movies centered on the conflict. Critically acclaimed new Hollywood classics like The Deer Hunter stand side by side with cheap, New Right-inspired revenge fantasies like Chuck Norris's Missing in Action or Sylvester Stallone First Blood Part 2. Hollywood depoliticized the struggle, as Frank Tomasula will have it, quote, by turning it into a test of manhood, a rite of passage, unquote. The underlying moral crisis of Hollywood's Vietnam can be summed up with the final words of the character of Private Chris Taylor in Oliver Stone's Platoon. We didn't fight the enemy, we fought ourselves, and the enemy was in us, unquote. Catherine Kinney calls that the trope of the friendly fire. Prestige movies like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, Casualties of War all end with a reckoning between Americans. Americans shooting other Americans. But also in movies like Missing in Action, the true enemy is not the Vietnamese, but the archetype of the bureaucrat, the Washington pencil pusher that forces Uncle Sam's warriors to fight Vietnamese communists with the ends tied behind the backs. And digging behind this and other archetypes, one can easily identify American myths. At its core, Hollywood's Vietnam is a projection. In the 15 years following the fall of Saigon, Hollywood pushed to the extreme the mythical absorption of the Vietnamese landscape already underway during the war years, when American directors projected on the American past, the genocide of Native Americans, national traumas like the massacre of My Lai, with movies like Soldier Blue or Little Big Man. They're actually about Vietnam. Starting from 1975, however, Hollywood blatantly reread the American intervention in Southeast Asia through the codes of American national culture. The Deer Hunter is a Western disguised as a war movie. Apocalypse Now is a detective story, inscribed also in the great tradition of the American romance centered on the encounter with the wilderness. And over time, secondhand cinematic memories of the war grafted themselves onto history, onto historical memories, like a suffocating vine. Right-wing movies turned the war into a fantasy of revenge, an opportunity to settle the score. Think about John Rambo when he says, "Do we get to win this time?" While more progressive films made it the battlefield of a reckoning within the American soul, with the building at the center of these movies that often revolves around a road to Damascus revelation in which the young GI realizes not so much that war is hell, but that war is not a John Wayne movie. And in fact, Hollywood's Vietnam is not a real place. It's a repository of American fantasies, a celluloid exorcism made only possible by the passing of time. The American imagination recast the name of a country into the name of a war, and the name of a war into a gallery of movie stills. These movie stills, these icons, still tower over the collective unconscious. Robert De Niro pointing the gun to his temple, Willem Dafoe raising the arms to the sky in sacrifice, Sylvester Stallone's scarred chest covered with bandoliers. No NLF officer ever used Russian roulette as a punishment. No air cavalry division ever attacked a village blaring out Wagner, yet these are the Vietnam War images that worldwide audiences, especially here in Italy, are usually familiar with. Sometimes even at the cost of semiotic short circuits with very tangible repercussions, such as, for example, in 1983, during Operation Urgent Fury, the US invasion of Grenada, American helicopters actually played the Ride of the Valkyries during an attack. And so you're not far from what Jean Baudrillard said, that in Apocalypse Now, the war became film, the film became war, and both are united by a common hemorrhage into technology. And myths go both ways. Apocalypse Now, for instance. Apocalypse Now paints a picture of the war in Vietnam as a bad trip of the American mind. By means of Vittorio Storaro's Caravaggio-style cinematography and Dean Tavolere's spectacular sets and sceneries, the movie turns Southeast Asia into a primeval landscape, a nightmarish jungle rife with burning crosses and pyramids of skulls. Coppola's Vietnam's geography makes little to no sense, with non-existent rivers, impossible distances, and place names signifying nothing. Its tiger-infested forests are punctuated by giant carcasses of warplanes covered with moss, looming over the heroes at gateways to dark worlds. When the enemy strikes, it comes in the form of a rain of arrows, or a burst of gunfire appearing out of nowhere. This is not Vietnam. This is not the Vietnam War. This is Dante. This is Homer. This is T.S. Eliot. And Hollywood all but cut the Vietnamese out of the picture. If American war narratives generally devote little space to the enemy's point of view, this rings even truer when it comes to cinematic depictions of Vietnamese communists. Basically, the racist dehumanization of the enemy is absolute in these movies. The enemy is a projection. It's not a real thing. It's an elusive, faceless creature, dangerously undistinguishable from the landscape. Hollywood refashioned the Viet Cong into a novel strand of movie monsters, sometimes in a literal sense, as you can see here in Aliens, James Cameron Aliens 1986, or Predator, by the way, where the Asian enemy is a transformed into an unstoppable, hive-minded killing machine that carries on human-wave Maoist attacks, whose monstrosity derives from the US Marines' inability to understand its motivations, with officers in the rear sending men to the massacre without ammunition for fear of hitting a fusion reactor with the aliens eyed, which is, of course, a clear reference to the American government's fear of using nuclear weapons against North Vietnam in order not to provoke Russia. I mean, one can, justify dehumanizing one's enemy, but things do not, certainly get better when it comes to cinematic depictions of America's allies. The whole panoply of stereotypes regarding South Vietnam is shown in this 6-vignette panel of Thi Bui's graphic memoir, Vietnamese-American graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do. In movies, the South Vietnamese comes off as hookers, corrupt, papa sans, kids looking for handouts. And basically, Hollywood turned the Republic of Vietnam into a nameless crowd of two-dimensional extras. Passive victims caught up in the crossfire, loyal savages grateful to the US, silk-robed seductresses speaking in poor English, and sleazy confidence men like the engineer from the infamous Miss Saigon musical still inhabit popular culture as phantasmatic projections. Hollywood's South Vietnam is now a pop archetype, a backlot filled with palm trees, surf rock music, treacherous natives who cannot be trusted, or infantilized civilians waiting for a white savior to come to the rescue. There is no agency whatsoever. And now enter Viet Thanh Nguyen. His 2015 debut novel, The Sympathizer, as controversial as it is a satire cum critique. It's not about war. It's about war narratives and the power rationales that allow for their unequal dissemination. It's a multifaceted literary object, a sharp indictment of the power mechanisms underlying how memory is disseminated, which is, of course, disguised as a piece of genre fiction, a spy thriller. I'm sure some of you already know this roughly, but the book tells the story of a communist double agent, the captain, whose mission is to follow abroad the defeated remnants of the South Vietnamese army on the eve of the country's collapse, which is, of course, a fictional version of the anti-communist real-life fronts that E.T. Nguyen collectively brands as the Homeland Restoration Movement. However, The Sympathizer takes unexpected turns, strays away from spy fiction, war fiction. Halfway through the novel, the narrator is hired as a movie consultant by an egotistical Hollywood director determined to craft a Vietnam War movie that will shine so brightly, will not just be about the war, I'm quoting him, but it will be the war. Of course, echoing a famous statement by Francis Ford Coppola himself. In the Philippines, where this fictional movie is being shot, the captain, the protagonist, the sympathizer, manages a group of Vietnamese extras recruited from a refugee camp. He is a helpless cog in a well-oiled machine, a war machine in this case, and he has no choice but to watch his fellow countrymen being reduced to the stage props, nothing more than stains on a lush matte painting, a faceless crowd of cinematic one-dimensional presences. As critic Sunny Xiang points out, it is impossible not to treat Nguyen's, fiction and nonfiction as a single coherent project. Viet Thanh Nguyen, of course, is a scholar before being an author. And his 2016 essay/manifesto, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, works as a sort of companion, scholarly companion to The Sympathizer, forming a fict critical diptych, whose two halves are one the mirror of the other. As per Viet Thanh Nguyen, the scholar, Apocalypse Now exposes American savagery only at the price of dehumanizing the Asians. If Coppola draws from Joseph Conrad, Nguyen's critique is informed by Chinua Achebe's, the Nigerian intellectual's own critique of Joseph Conrad, a famous essay named An Image of Africa. Conrad, Achebe argues, reads Africa as a metaphysical battlefield devoid of any recognizable humanity, nothing more than a backdrop, against which, of course, the petty European consciousness of Hertz is set. And Viet Thanh Nguyen, too, argues that Apocalypse Now, and here I quote it, deploys a limited ethical vision that allows looking inside the white man's heart of darkness, where it's both human and inhuman, at the expense of keeping the other simply inhuman. either a savage threat or a faceless victim, unquote. So Coppola's movie, the scholar slash novelist argues, denounces American neocolonial brutality only at the price of using Asian bodies as movie props. The Conradian theme of the river journey as a journey back in time, basically turns, literally reduces local peoples and landscapes to one thing. With Americans at the center of the frame, Vietnamese, Filipinos, and Ifugao actors employed by Coppola become nothing more than spots on the backdrop. That is the perspective of Nguyen as a scholar. So how does Nguyen, the author, react? The Sympathizers Hollywood subplot, I will argue, is itself a fantasy of revenge. A fantasy of revenge that targets fantasies of revenge. In The Sympathizer, Apocalypse Now becomes the Hamlet. That's the name of the fictional movie. And its satire is not a good-spirited parody of Hollywood like Tropic Thunder, Hot Shot. They made, parodies of Hollywood Vietnam War movies. Nguyen's cuts deeper. The very title, The Hamlet, seems to take aim at Apocalypse Now's pretensions, literary pretensions, Coppola's attempt to transform the American war in Vietnam into a tragedy of fools, Shakespearean soliloquies. The Hamlet is a film within the novel. Some noted a reference to The Murder of Gonzago, the play within the play in Shakespeare's The Hamlet, in which the Prince of Denmark staged a mise en abîme of his father's death to study the reaction of his uncle and prepare the revenge. Through The Hamlet, Viet Thanh Nguyen does exactly the same thing. He writes a fake movie that helps the reader recognize that there is something rotten in Hollywood's quote-unquote Vietnam. And The Hamlet is not a parody of Apocalypse Now, as many critics quite lazily maintain sometimes, but a parody of its making. Is a Frankenstein monster of a movie. Is made of limbs, made of at least 8 other movies. And in addition to misrepresentation of the American wars, such as Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Casualties of War, the parody movie also draws from movies about the Korean War or the First Indochina War, like Samuel Fuller's The Still Hamlet, or China Gate. His main model, however, is The Green Beret by and with John Wayne, 1968, which is the most blatantly reactionary movie of the entire cinematic genre that we are looking at here. In Nothing Ever Dies, Nguyen, as a scholar, posits that the entire Vietnam movie genre is nothing more than a collective effort of memorial revanchism. In The Sympathizer, the theory becomes practice. By juxtaposing a cinephile's darling like Apocalypse Now with, a 2-bit flick like, Missing in Action or The Green Beret itself, movies steeped in patriotic rhetoric, and by showing the darkest and most ridiculous sides of the legendarily troubled production of Coppola's masterpiece in the Philippines, Viet Thanh Nguyen in turn performs a fantasy of revenge. He sends an alter ego of his back in the 70s in order to shed light on Hollywood simulacra. The novel is not the story of the war from the Vietnamese point of view, many people still saying this falsity, but it's a story about the films about the Vietnam War from the perspective of the Vietnamese extras. The captain is a vector of Nguyen's scholarly critique on the industries of memory, a literary double of Viet Thanh Nguyen, to whom the author assigns the task that would have fallen to his friend Kyuk Jin had she obtained American citizenship a few years earlier. So The Sympathizer is Viet Thanh Nguyen's way to prove his thesis in real time by means of fiction, as the movie is being shot, instead that decades later in a USC classroom. The novel demonstrates how the difference between films that criticize and exalt war, between John Wayne and Francis Ford Coppola, between conservative Hollywood and the rebellious Hollywood birthed out of the 1960s counterculture, is less profound than many will have been inclined to think. I said that critics are lazy to call The Hamlet a spoof of Apocalypse Now, right? Plot-wise, the real movie and the fictional movie have very little in common. In The Hamlet, there is no river, no Cambodian temple, and the iconic battlefield the helicopter battle is moved to the end of the movie and becomes a generic war movie set piece battle rather than the editing masterpiece that we still study in film schools. The structure of the Hamlet, more than the hero's journey that we see in Apocalypse Now, follows the line of Vietnam War movies center on like an Alamo-like setting, like for instance, The Siege of Fire Base Gloria, which is a movie that I only have seen, I guess, where heroes desperately defend a base under attack as it was a fort in Indian territory. You see, American national culture. There are references in the Hamlet, there are references to Platoon. We have a young and innocent protagonist. To Full Metal Jacket, there is a scene in which we see a motorcycle heist. To another movie, was called Go Tell the Spartans, to China Gate, in which we see a native girl helping the Americans, and we see an African-American soldier falling into a booby trap, to Casualties of War and Rambo First Blood Part 2, we have rape scenes, torture scenes, and to the Missing in Action Chuck Norris-led saga, because we have sadistic and cartoonish racist villains. The Hamlet, however, is primarily a rewriting of The Green Beret. Here it is. John Wayne's movie was released in 1968 amid heated controversies. It's basically a propaganda work designed to put the American intervention in China under a good light. In the genealogy of the Vietnam War movie genre, The Green Berets is more an isolated case. It's very ungenerous to pile this movie up with Apocalypse Now. Let me put it this way. And Viet Thanh Nguyen does exactly that. In the middle of the 1960s counterculture, Wayne shot a movie so blatantly right-wing that elicited countless hostile reactions. The Green Berets reduces the history of the special forces to a Western formula made of good guys, bad guys, civilians. In the movie, we see the Green Berets guarding the construction of a base in South Vietnamese territory named Dodge City. And American technology of death is exalted as a benign force. We B-52s depicted as invisible angels protecting the innocent. Near Dodge City stands a small Montagnard village whose inhabitants are brutally massacred by the enemy, triggering American revenge. And the film culminates with a covert mission. And as in other movies, like The Seal Hamlet, for instance, we see a character of an Asian orphan, Chuk, that's his made-up name, which is the key of the story, a true, as someone said, emotional energy conductor that transforms imperialism into paternalism. Now, if one were to draft a synopsis of the Hamlet, it will be very difficult to distinguish it from the Green Berets. The made-up movie in The Sympathizer is a story of a blonde sergeant, a preppy boy full of ideals, like in Platoon by Oliver Stone, by the way, same thing, who trains a local militia alongside a captain whose name is Will Seamus, because names in The Sympathizer are always, metafictional and, very ironic. And this captain is a mix with this Will Seamus guy, is a mix of Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, the character of John Wayne in The Green Berets, and the character of Burt Lancaster in Go Tell the Spartans. The eponymous Hamlet of the Hamlet is a nest of communist infiltrators, friendly faces hiding hostile intentions. And in The Sympathizer, of course, the entire Vietnam movie genre is compressed into this single story, but Viet Thanh Nguyen doesn't fail to encompass the entire corollary of xenophobic cliches that the genre carries with it, indexing the unwritten relationship that links American wars in Asia with their representations in popular culture. And so the Hamlet is pretty much a narrative oddity, a Hollywood impossibility, an outstandingly crafted B-movie, a crass slugfest shot with mastery, a 1950s pro-war movie with the violence of 1980s B-movies shot with the budget and artistic ambition of anti-war masterpieces of Cimino, Coppola, Kubrick, and Stone. In devising the Hamlet, Nguyen merged plots of anti-war classics with tropes of, testosterone-filled action flicks. His purpose was to show how deep down movies like Missing in Action and Apocalypse Now are more alike than one would realize. As if satisfying a revenge fantasy of his own, Nguyen dismantles the mythos that surrounds the making of Coppola's masterpiece, turning the epic behind the epic into a farce behind the farce. Because in The Sympathizer, Apocalypse Now becomes a jingoistic mess packed with trite characters, ready-made dialogues that no cinephile worth their salt would ever stand to watch. So this is the ultimate fantasy of revenge. Viet Thanh Nguyen makes Francis Ford Coppola the director of The Green Beret. And also, it should be noted that the Hamlet is much closer to the original vision of Apocalypse Now by screenwriter John Milius. We intended originally Apocalypse Now as a shoddy, unequivocally pro-war John Wayne movie, oozing patriotism. Milius' original 1969 script, and I read it, is a fascist psychedelic extravaganza in which Colonel Kurtz is a Charles Manson, a military hippie guy that smokes marijuana while commanding arc-light incursions to the tune of The Doors' discography. The Hamlet ends exactly like Milius' Apocalypse Now, with a big bang, not with the whisper that we see in the final version. Again, it's the friendly fire trope, American killing Americans, Vietnam as a projection of this tragedy of the American soul. The Hamlet doesn't need this hypocrisy. It's a satire. And so the auteur ends his movie with a pile of dead Vietnamese guys, and the message is not the enemy was in us, but is we must save the good Asians by killing the bad Asians. However, the idea of the Viet Cong as a monster, the fact that the enemy is a pure entity, and that is a quality that has to be admired, which is the crux of Apocalypse Now, remains unchanged. The Hamlet's villain is a racist caricature. He has the name of the ultimate symbol of otherness in American and Western culture, King Kong, obviously. And, the Viet Congs in the Hamlet are not the noble savages of Apocalypse Now. They are monstrous beings, black and white villains, part of that lineage of cinematic baddies linked to the stereotype of the Yellow Peril, Dr. Fu Manchu, Ming the Merciless. There is no apparent trace of this stereotype in Apocalypse Now, but if you dig deep enough, the Yellow Peril resurfaces, even in Coppola's masterpiece, hidden under the script's rewritings. Apocalypse Now argues that the United States lost in Vietnam because America was not prepared to embrace the horror, the primitive mentality of the enemy. They are noble because they fight with their guts like animals, says Kurtz in the 1975 draft of the script, and for an idea. That's rich. We fight with ingenious machines and fire like gods and for nothing, unquote. Of course, we all know that the PAVN won the Vietnam War with tanks, not with arrows. But in this binary juxtaposition, purity versus hypocrisy, ideas versus nothing, animals versus gods, lies the ultimate meaning of Coppola's movie. Kurtz's base is a literal cannibalization of the quote-unquote Oriental other, a Cambodian temple modeled after Angkor Wat, littered with Asian corpses. When Willard mimics Kung Fu style in his model room, the white character self-orientalizes himself. He embraces the same violence, primordial violence. And the same goes with imperialist guerrillas like John Rambo that gives up technology and disguise themselves as natives, defeating the enemy at his own game. As Viet Thanh Nguyen reminds us, in combining revenge fantasies and prestige movies into a single product, the need to embrace this Oriental barbarism, as you want to call it, and the exaltation of brutality permeates both things. In other words, there is not much difference between the apocryphal, of course, anecdote of the NLF guerrillas cutting the arms of vaccinated children that Kurtz recounts in his monologue, and the inhuman grin of Chuck Norris' antagonists, aside from the quality of the cinematography. But there is more. The last and most crucial element of The Sympathizer's satire cum critique of the Vietnam War movie genre is its emphasis on the shared origin of the death technology that enables both the war and its cinematic representations. The choice of Apocalypse Now's filming location, writes Sylvia Chung, is clear evidence of the imperialist nature of military engagement in Asia, the United States. By focusing on the collaboration between Coppola and Filipino President Ferdinand Marcos, Nguyen exposes the hypocrisy of a movie that critiques U.S. policy in Vietnam while receiving help and helicopters, American helicopters, from a government that was even more corrupt and authoritarian than, the military juntas that reigned in Saigon in the 60s and 70s. Just as the U.S. drugged the South Vietnamese economy by importing consumer goods instead of capital, creating an illusion of prosperity in which the abundance of goods masked reality of underdevelopment, Coppola, in his own way, did the same in the Philippines, unsettling the local economy with sudden as temporary injections of cash that deprived local industries of labor. By the end of the filming, Francis Ford Coppola himself had become Kurtz, an Ayatollah, megalomaniacal dictator at the head of an empire made of air-conditioned bungalows, enacting the same situation that he was trying to denounce. Marcos provided him with enough weapons and helicopters to start a war on his own, an arsenal that Marcos accumulated because of the ties of the government with the US. And during the filming of the movie, helicopters left the set to carry out real military actions against local insurgents. And as Viet Thanh Nguyen told me, originally the novel included a sketch in which the sympathizer was, going with the helicopters. And so the death technology of American origin becomes the common denominator between neocolonial exploitation and the cinematic representation that criticize neocolonial exploitation. In The Sympathizer, this invisible connection is repeatedly emphasized by the narrator that highlights how Hollywood's artificial annihilation of the quote-unquote natives is just a link in a chain that doesn't begin or ends with Vietnam, a sequel to our war, a prequel to the next one. And so mass death, whether real or fictional, becomes the leitmotif of a single project, equally made of art and violence. That's Viet Thanh Nguyen's vision. In this sense, the central paradox of the parody of the Vietnam War movie genre also arises from the anecdote reported in sources about Vietnamese refugees being recruited as extras. If in China Gate, the Asian villain is Lee Van Cleef in Yellowface, if the gorillas in The Deer Hunter are Thai extras, and you can hear that, of course, by their language, and if the villains in Missing in Action are Korean-American actors, the need for authenticity led Coppola to hire hundreds of Vietnamese refugees recruited from the Morong refugee camps in Bataan province. In most cases, the Vietnamese played the part of corpses without complaining too much, as you can see here. Their faces, half buried in the dirt, are visible in many frames, the documentary Hearts of Darkness. And you can see the decapitated heads drinking Coca-Cola during the breaks. In the infamous sampan scene in Apocalypse Now, the actors playing the victims were a doctor and a lawyer, desperate both people looking for work, that had arrived 2 days earlier on the Philippine coast. And as of course is obvious, the communist guerrillas slaughtered by Kilgore's helicopters in the village are also Vietnamese refugees. So you can see, this image as that tells everything. You see basically people displaced because of communist aggression, forced to play communist guerrillas for $1 a day, essentially. And so the same dynamic occurs in the Hamlet. Of course, the tragic irony is that you see the paradox of a group of refugees forced to play a role in the misrepresentation of their own history. And many of the corpses are authentically Vietnamese and both things, reducing people to stage props for a dramatization of the very conflict that displaced them. And from Eleanor Coppola's diary, Viet Thanh Nguyen takes this real command, dead Vietnamese at their, dead Vietnamese take your places, with the refugee extras reduced to zombies of the American imagination, a visible personification of the war's erasure in national conscience. And there is also, of course, the real anecdote of the set designer that used real corpses taken from a cemetery to decorate the set, Filipino corpses in this case. So the rhetoric of the Hollywood miracle, the myth that surrounds Apocalypse Now, glosses over these details as to where, just anecdotes, curious, funny anecdotes. But imagine the reaction if a Filipino crew were to make a movie in California taking corpses from a cemetery to decorate the set. So Apocalypse and the Hamlet use human beings, dead or alive, Vietnamese or Filipino, as background. And thus, Viet Thanh Nguyen carries to the extreme the ideas of Chinua Achebe on Heart of Darkness, the reduction of Africans to props, showing that in the case of Hollywood Vietnam, the Nigerian intellectual's concept is more than just a turn of phrase. And so by drawing a gap between the gravitas surrounding the Hamlet and, of course, the objective poverty of the plot, in other words, by showing, a crew committing atrocities in the name of art, in the name of a second-rate movie, Viet Thanh Nguyen reminds us that desecrating human remains in the name of art, it's still pretty much equivalent to desecrating human remains. The Vietnamese in Apocalypse Now are played by fleeing refugees miraculously escaping the dangers of the sea, forced by hunger to play a role in the self-justifying fantasy of the same nation that partially shaped their fate. By telling the story of Hollywood's Vietnam from their perspective, Viet Thanh Nguyen fulfills his own fantasy of revenge by creating a simulacrum of a simulacrum, a misrepresentation of a cinematic genre entirely made of misrepresentation. And with this, I conclude. Thank you.